welcome to Parents for Public Schools 30th anniversary virtual gala celebration. We're thrilled to welcome you to our pre-gala event featuring what we think will be a very engaging and timely discussion on the future of public education in the pandemic era. My name is Alan Richard. I'll be your moderator for this panel discussion. And in addition to serving as a member of the National Board for Parents for Public Schools, I work for the nonpartisan Southern Regional Education Board, which works to improve education in 16 states. And I'm a longtime education writer, writing for Education Week and a number of other publications across the country. Joining me this evening for this discussion, we have two esteemed guests, Dr. John H. Jackson, who's president and CEO of the Schott Foundation for Public Education. Welcome, John. We also have Dr. KaSheta Jackson, the Vice President for Health Equity and Social Impact at Vidant Health in North Carolina, and she's a board member of Parents for Public Schools of Pitt County, North Carolina, and a Parents for Public Schools Parent Leadership Institute graduate. Please refer to your commemorative e-program for our distinguished panelists' full bios. We had hoped that Superintendent Jaime Alicea of the Syracuse City School District would be joining us tonight, but he is unable to. I've prepared a few questions that I think will be on the top of everyone's mind after the past 2 years and all the challenges faced by public school families, teachers, school leaders, and everyone across the U.S. But you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists toward the end of this discussion. So let's go ahead and get started. John and KaSheta, if you're ready. I thought I'd start off by just, noting that obviously we sort of have two major things going on with education the past couple of years. One obviously is the pandemic. This is also a time, kind of an interesting political environment in the US, needless to say. So I wondered how those two things have impacted you in your work and in the schools that you interact with or are familiar with in your roles. John, I wondered if you might take that first question first.
Sure. Thank you, Alan, and congratulations, Parents for Public Schools, on your 30th anniversary. I will say, the last couple of years has impacted the work that we do at the Schott Foundation in very significant ways. We primarily provide grants to parent and student-led organizations who are fighting for education justice. And it became quite clear early in at the beginning of the pandemic that these are also the same individuals that are fighting for racial equity across the board. And so while they're also experiencing and living in the inequities, they're also fighting to change and bring a level of equity within their communities. Equity related to how the community is addressing COVID, the racial inequities that exist. So we've had to support our grantee partners in much different ways, recognizing that they are both experiencing this and they are advocates. Secondly, the last 2 years has made more vivid the racial inequities that exist across the board that impact educational outcomes. Access to healthcare is an education issue. Access to healthy food, transportation, childcare, all of these are education issues. They have been so often forgotten as factors that impact student learning, but when they impact children and families, ultimately they also impact learning outcomes. But I think COVID and definitely the social justice challenges that we've experienced over the last couple of years has made that more evident than ever.
Thanks, John. KaSheta, how has the pandemic and the current political environment in the U.S. impacted you and your work and the schools there in Pitt County?
Again, thank you for an opportunity to commemorate your 30th anniversary. To echo Dr. Jackson's comments as well, here in Eastern North Carolina, we're pretty much in a rural area. So the pandemic, when it came through as a perfect storm. Politics, racial issues, on top of the issues that we already have with access of healthcare, it only highlighted more of our focus. We understood and learned that some of our children, as Dr. Jackson just spoke about, are dealing with social determinants of health, lack of access to fresh foods, education. We learned internet was a difficult issue. But my background being a nurse, it was even more of a cause of concern because we saw our peers, our neighbors, and even our educators having to figure out how do we navigate through this new landscape that we've called COVID for the last 2 years, and we're still trying to navigate it now. The way that we understand our climate will never be the same as what it was this time 2 years ago. I saw a little meme online that if we knew what was going to happen in the next couple of days, how would we react? And I like to think that we would still react the same way, with humility, with compassion, with a act for our own neighbors. So when I think about the political climate, it is unfortunate that such things as masks, education, information in schools impacted how our children and our communities handle this unfortunate series of events.
Well, thanks so much. And I wondered how both of you sort of see the future of public education moving forward. One of the great things about Parents for Public Schools is that it helps more and more parents and families get engaged in their own children and grandchildren's education, sort of, at arm's length. But it also helps people engage in local and state policy making, knowing how to speak with the school board, to speak out on statewide issues, to advocate for change or improvement if that's what's needed in their schools. And so I just wondered what's your view of kind of more broadly about public education moving forward, and then we'll talk maybe about some closer issues at hand. But what about the big picture? What's going to be different looking forward?
Dr. Jackson, I'll start, and I'll ask you to finish it out just in case I missed a couple of issues. When I look at what COVID has presented us with, is presented every parent with a voice. I was fortunate, as you mentioned, to have gone through the graduate program for PEP and to understand how do we navigate through that system, how as a parent and a community member, I have a voice for my children. We saw more people going to the school board to speak about masks or the book lists that were coming out. So I am very excited that as we move on to this next phase of the school year, that we'll see more people who are just as interested to advocate for what they believed in, that they will be there advocating for our public education, advocating for more dollars, having teachers who have the resources that they need, our schools to have the resources that they need to be successful. So I think the future is very bright. We've learned a lot. We know that we can take technology to move us forward as long as we eliminate some of the barriers.
Well, that's a silver lining for sure. John, what do you think?
I think Dr. Jackson is right. I love saying that. I think that, one thing that we know that the majority of children and families and parents have been educated in our public school system, by our public school system in the past. It holds true today and will likely hold true tomorrow. And in every sector across our country, many of those sectors are being led by public school graduates. So I think the future of our public school system is bright because it has to remain bright for our democracy to remain strong. That being said, one of the things that we've learned over the last couple of, or experienced over the last couple of years, is there's a way to do learning that we can engage community in a different way, and moving toward models of campus without walls. It doesn't mean that we are getting rid of the need for the public school, traditional public school, But what we are doing is engaging the community as a part of that learning process. They're rich individuals and rich history and rich things that students can learn right in their community that the future will present an opportunity for that to happen. So I think that, like Dr. Jackson, the future of our public school system is bright. It is going to take youth and parent leaders advocating much in the same way they've always done in history, for us to continue to have a well-funded and fully resourced public education system. But those are the parents and students that make our democracy work. And as our democracy continues to work, our public education system will remain strong.
Well, you both have very optimistic views of the future. You don't seem to be beaten down by the isolation of the pandemic and some of the political divisions that are happening. You seem to sort of be empowered by that. I wondered why that is. I know I'm not supposed to ask that question, but that really strikes me as a little bit unexpected. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I will say the first part of the pandemic, we spent home. I'm fortunate that I have my husband and my boys and my family live very close. But the first couple of months, it was darkness, and you have a choice. You can continue to stay there, or you can figure out how do you work through. And being in this area, we tend to rally. If you're from North Carolina, you know, you rally behind your communities and you figure out how do we get things done. So I choose not to continue to stay in that darkness. We have people who are relying on us to get up, get moving, and get resources to them. So unfortunately, COVID was horrible. It was hard on our healthcare system. It was very hard on our communities. There were many people who are no longer here with us. But we also understand that there were some great things. If you can see a little bit of light that came from that, we understand that our workforce can be different. We can practice more work-life balance. You can be on a Zoom meeting while you're exercising, which a couple of years ago, that's something that you wouldn't be able to do. You can talk to your doctor in the comforts of your home. That technology was a little bit slower. Again, addressing some of those social determinants of health when we're looking at access and transportation. So I am looking forward to what the system, what this will bring in the near future, because we've spent so much time being afraid. I have a saying, we live faith over fear. So we've spent all of that time in our little holes, and now we're having to figure out how do we continue to do what we need to do for each other and for our communities.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's a saying, you never waste a great crisis. And this is over the past couple of years, that's what we've been in. And we've seen how during divisive periods in our country, we have come out a little stronger. In 1963, a very divisive period, we saw the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and fair housing. And we are going through this period now. We witnessed the tragic killing of George Floyd, but we also witnessed hundreds and thousands of individuals of all backgrounds, of all races and ethnicities come together to sort of say that that behavior would not be tolerated in our country. We saw new legislation, and yes, there are legislation that's working against the ability for individuals to vote. But I believe that there are more good people across this country than those that are divided. And that has carried us a long way. And I just have faith that it's going to carry us, make us stronger in the future.
Well, along those same lines, I wondered what each of you thought about kind of the notion of equity in education, what that means, especially now, and also some thoughts that you might have for parents and allies of parents and families in public and children in public schools, how they can join the fight for greater equity and speak out on issues that matter right about now. So what about the equity question and being involved, if indeed some people are moving? Who wants to start, Jonas?
I've started before first. Please start first.
Well, for me, equity is still where race, ethnicity, or gender is not a determinative of outcomes. Once we get to that space where there's an equal opportunity to succeed, and in some situations, equal opportunity not to succeed, we will know that we have a level of equity, and that's what we continue to work towards. I think, you've got to sort of get in where you fit in as far as parents and youth leaders. It's as simple as becoming engaged in the local school councils, if those where that is possible. There are opportunities to work with young people. There's opportunities to join grassroots organizations that are pushing for policies and legislation to bring equity to various parts of the learning experience. So you really sort of have to figure out where you fit in or where you would like to fit in, and then it becomes pretty contagious. I know a number of parents who started working with local school councils, then decided to run for city council, then decided to run for state legislature. So it's a process, but there's an on-ramp for everyone. And at the Shot Foundation, I would encourage everyone to go to our website, shotfoundation.org. There are a number of grassroots organizations and coalitions across the country that are looking for great people to become a part of this fight.
To take myself back off mute. So just to echo exactly what Dr. Jackson said, but using the definition as well, just reading the clear definition off of Google, it is the quality of being fair and impartial. So when I think about that, it goes to what I think about with healthcare. Everybody deserves healthcare, even though you have an inability, some may have the inability to pay, they still deserve the same type of healthcare. So I liken that back to education, that when we look at some of our schools, certain decisions are made of where we build our houses because the school's grades. What if we did something crazy, like send our kids to those schools and we get in there and we work to make those schools better instead of some people moving to a certain location because that's the good school. If parents, as you mentioned, the grassroots, if parents get in and start showing up, you don't have to be there every day. I am fortunate that I have a job every day that I have to work, but I try to make sure that I'm there. So joining PTA, making sure that your voice is being heard, you're showing up when they're asking for volunteers, that you're checking in with your teacher to let them know that you're a partner. That's how we improve equity in our classrooms, that you're not just showing up for the school board meeting to argue about your decision or your choices, that you're there to support your educators, to make sure that you're rallying for them so that they can provide the same programs that those good schools have that a lot of people decide to move to. So when I think of equity, I think of how do we move the needle from the good school to the not so good school to all schools have the same rights, the same education, the same caliber of teachers at every one of those schools. So you're not able to say that's a good school, that's not a good school, or that's a school for certain people. If we get to that point, I think our education system, our school systems will look better.
Well, that harkens back to the beginnings of Parents for Public Schools 30 years ago, or a little more than 30 years ago now. Parents in Jackson, Mississippi got together, and the district was seeing the departure of a lot of families of means who were able to leave the school system. Well, white parents and black parents got together and founded Parents for Public Schools and said, we're staying. These are our kids' schools. This is our cities. This is our community schools. We want to work together. And it's amazing if you sort of put people at the same table, what you can accomplish together. And of course, we now have chapters all over the country in big cities and small towns. And we've had, sometimes chapters come and go over time, but they definitely have played an important role in those communities, and hopefully Parents for Public Schools can have an even more substantial voice nationally moving forward. I wondered about just sort of the impact on children, on students from the pandemic, and kind of what it's like from each of your perspectives, KaSheta as a parent, as well as somebody who's involved in your local schools. And John, you work with schools all over the country. I just wondered if what you're hearing out there in terms of how kids are doing, both academically and emotionally, and if you have any thoughts on some next steps that our schools need to take to help support kids better. KaSheta, you want to start with that one?
So thank you. I can speak from a personal, because I see the schools that my boys go through. During the pandemic, we were our children's teachers. We were trying to navigate work, navigate and teach. I will tell you that my son is so thankful to be back in the classroom, trying to help him understand all of those things. It only gave me more of an appreciation of what our teachers go through, what our administrators go through, and that makes me want to support them even the more. With the kids going back to school, they're taking a lot of things with them. They're taking 2 years of loneliness, uncertainty, and fear. I think a lot of what our roles as parents is that we support them. We know that some kids spent a lot of time by themselves, and we had concerns for safety. The reason why we know that the best place for kids to be is in school. I think there's still a gap and a lag. I do think, and I've spoken to my son's teachers about it, that there's a gap in March the 13th of 2021 to where we are, 2020 to where we are right now. My son is an 8th grader, and we're still struggling with math, and we're struggling with ELA. But I don't necessarily think that the pandemic did all of that. It just showed that there are some areas that we need to do better, that we need to look at our overall education of how we're teaching our kids. Every kid isn't going to learn the same. And we learned that with being home, that hybrid model didn't work for everyone. All internet model did not work for everyone. So we have to figure out how do we meet children where they are to make sure that they are successful in the next coming years.
I think that's right. The pandemic definitely highlighted gaps that exist, and many of these gaps have been there. But what it did was actually call the question on how local districts and states are going to triage in order to begin to address those gaps. In many respects, there was a high degree of isolation. I had to sort of father my teenage daughter through her senior year in the midst of a pandemic. High degree of isolation. This wasn't anticipated even before you deal with any of the other academic issues. And what we see now, I sit on a university board, and what we see now are young people are having severe mental health challenges. That we have to, at the university level, increase our mental health support. And I imagine at the K through 12 level, most districts should be really looking at how do they provide the level of mental health support for young people. Again, if they don't have the supports necessary to learn, it's virtually impossible to provide them the type of pedagogy that's necessary for them to achieve the outcomes that are desired. So this is about more than just looking at, highly experienced teachers. It's about more than just looking at what's happening in the schoolhouse, but it's looking at what's happening to our students as individuals, as a part of a family unit, what's happening to families, and then how do we build the types of tables, Alan, you used the word table. How do we build a type of systemic table where health and human services is at that table? The definitely higher education at the table, philanthropy is at the table. In some cases, legal services, housing is at the table, so that we build the type of civic table that's necessary that can triage any challenge that a young person is having, so that there's the support necessary to address that, so that that young person will have a fair and substantive opportunity to learn.
And if I could, Alan, to add, because one thing that when John was speaking, I think about our mental health. I think about in some of the schools that we're looking at, making mental health education or resources available to our children who may hear that you should not talk to anyone about your problems, your concerns, and your fears. And potential, more importantly, we hear that in the Black community, that you don't talk about mental health, and we keep those things bottled up. And then you grow up into an adult who is not able to handle life concerns and issues. And then that becomes a cycle that, you know, if you're not able to handle issues here, it becomes something bigger, it becomes something bigger. And there are more resources if we can just stop right now at the table that you're speaking of, John, and bring mental health there, have mental health counselors, or have mental health crisis counselors available for students, not just when an event happens, but having them there in the beginning. The counselors are doing all they can to handle the issues prior to the pandemic. We need to have that support there available now afterwards, because the things that we see now are not going to just go away when we all remove our mask and say that we're free of COVID. We hear of fights and things that are occurring every day in our public schools. Some of those things are just triggers. You can say you have on the wrong shoe, and kids are at the middle age kids, they have so much buildup of whatever, anxiety, stress, they trying to fit in with your peers. I think having mental health in your schools available, SROs are great for safety, but we need to figure out how do we address issues early versus having someone addressing the issues afterwards.
Definitely. I know we're seeing a lot of mental health professionals now, more mental health professionals and school counselors working in schools. A lot of community partnerships maybe that weren't there or weren't there quite as completely before the pandemic. And I know some of the federal relief aid can be used for those purposes. It seems that, you know, kind of just including that in the school culture, that mental health is just part of good health, and talking about that as adults, as professionals, and making sure people know the services that are available, and even just talking with people is an important thing to do. Talking with a trusted friend or colleague or relative is such an important thing right now. I wanted to ask a question about just kind of for all the PPS members out there and our allies, if you have a thought on sort of, you know, it's an action that ordinary folks can take to engage in and strengthen public schools, either locally on the ground or more broadly. I don't know if you, this is far down our list of questions that were prepared for our panelists, but you both are so very involved in education. I thought it'd be okay to ask you that, that, you know, what's something all of us can do to push, to strengthen and help improve our schools. I know one of the cool things about PPS, for people who don't know, is that you're sort of parents who go through some of the workshops and the parent engagement program often become critical friends. They're very active and supportive of the teachers, of the school staff, of the school leaders, but at the same time aren't afraid, and because of that trust that's built, aren't afraid to push for change when necessary, and to make suggestions and to engage in those ways. So I wondered about how all of us can do that in some kind of way to improve public schools for every child. Who wants to start with that one?
I'll start. I think first, really engaging the school to ensure that it is a climate that is open and inclusive for all students. And we can't understate that, how important that is, that every young person who walks into that school is able to see themselves, however they might be, present and successful in that space. And really working to put in place the types of programs and the supports to make that happen. Because ultimately, when we talk about education, we can talk about accountability, we can talk about standards, but for the most part, parents and students, what they want to know, does this school care about my child? Is it committed? I have a colleague, Gail Christopher, who often says that racism is nothing but institutionalized lovelessness. And at the end of the day, parents and students want to know, does this system love my child? So we're really working to build loving systems. And I believe that if we see that as our goal, loving system where every young person who walks through that door sees themselves represented, I think it's important, which then takes us to the importance of ensuring that you exist in a school that's willing to teach our full history, America's full history across the board. And I know that there have been a number of conversations going on around critical race theory, which in many respects is a distraction. What we're asking is that history, America's history, is taught in its totality, because it provides an opportunity for more of our young people to be seen within the context of the progress of this country and where we are today. And I know that it's difficult. And we talked about how in many of the districts where we see these anti-CRT policies moving forward, it's districts where the racial demographics have changed over 10% within the last decade. So that change is difficult. But again, if we reorient ourselves toward this goal of collectively building a loving system, we can't get that way without taking and having conversations around history, having conversations around representation, support, and really being there for our young people, keeping the young students as the central focus and why we're building these loving systems.
And just to repeat the question for KaSheta, we're having some audio problems. I was asking KaSheta about just what all of us can do to engage in and help strengthen and improve public schools for every child. I was saying that one of the great things about Parents for Public Schools is a lot of the folks who are involved across the country become critical friends of school systems. They're both supportive and very engaged with the teachers and principals and counselors and school staff and even the superintendent and others at the district level. But that because of that trust and those relationships that are built, they're also able to push for change when necessary, to make suggestions, and their voices are heard because of that engagement. So I just wondered if you had some thoughts for their maybe parents or allies, something they can do to help engage, strengthen, and engage and strengthen public schools in their communities.
Thank you for repeating. So yes, as John mentioned, critical race theory is a conversation that's occurring in every school board. I know the ones that I've attended and listened to online is a conversation that we talk about. So it leads me back to what brought us to the place that we are now. You know, separate but equal, that wasn't truly a true statement. But then we have to look at Brown versus the Board of Education, and teaching that in our understanding that our schools need to be they need to be desegregated. We need to have individuals being able to learn in the school of their choice. And we need to have individuals who can talk about what the past was like. Because if we don't repeat and understand the past, we're going to repeat the past. If we're not talking to each other about where we came from, we're going to go back. So I think that having our allies, our parents, and a good relationship with our school members, that we can come to a really good understanding is why is it important for us to talk about the past. We talk about history, we talk about Benjamin Franklin, we talk about the Constitution, we teach our students about what happened with the Mayflower. So we teach all of that. those things sound great. In 1776, we got our independence. All of those things are great, but we also need to talk about some of those days with our civil rights when individuals did not have the right to vote. I meant when Dr. Jackson just spoke about 1964, that's our voting rights, that with certain populations did not have the right to vote. And that was not that long ago. That was during the time my mother was born. So we need to talk about the past so that we don't repeat it. And I know that that's a touchy subject. We want to just turn our backs or close our eyes or act like it didn't happen, but it did. And it's important that we talk about it so we can have a civil conversation about it, and not as a way of making others feel bad, but understand that we don't repeat it.
Well, I know that in my conversations with a lot of the board members and people involved in Parents for Public Schools across the country, there is agreement that indeed not enough. There needs to be more history and context taught about our country rather than less. And I don't know about y'all, but most of the educators I know are able to do those in skilled ways. They're able to do those professionally, compassionately, and accurately. And fortunately, more and state and local, curriculum and guidelines include that sort of thing. And if anything, we need more of it, not less. That's for sure. I know that the Parents for Public Schools feels that way. I think we're nearing the end of our time together, unfortunately. And I don't see any questions. I think there's some issues with the chat, so our audience out there can't ask questions. But I'll go ahead and wrap things up and just thank you both so much for participating with us. To Dr. Jackson's, Dr. John Jackson and Dr. KaSheta Jackson, for this wonderful discussion. And I appreciate everyone in the audience for joining us this evening. I believe we're recording this too, so people can see it later as well. I do have a few instructions. Thank you again, John and KaSheta. Really appreciate it. And thanks for your work. Now, I have a few instructions for all of us to get into the main gala, which will start at about 7 o'clock. Please return to the attendee hub by clicking back to my event at the top left of your screens. And then you'll scroll down to upcoming sessions and click on the virtual pre-gala cocktail reception. So go up to back to my event at the top left, scroll down to upcoming sessions, and you can choose the cocktail reception. And then the full gala and program will start in about 15 minutes. And hopefully you'll have that option to choose from that menu as well. And I'm going to ask the Parents for Public Schools staff, Julius and Alicia, if there's anything else folks need to know before we let them go.
No, Alan, you got it.
Thank you, Shawnee. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks again, John and KaSheta, for this. And thanks to everyone at Parents for Public Schools and who's involved with it across the country. We'll see you at the cocktail reception now and the full gala here in just a few minutes. Thank you again. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you all
Thanks
have.
for going with the flow.
No problem. Great job.
Yep. Thanks for making it nice and simple and easy. The CRT question, I wanted to talk about that forever, but I know that that's a touchy
right
subject.
on. Thanks for bringing that up, both of you, and for being so eloquent about it. I don't know what the big deal is. It's like you said, it's a distraction,
Right.
from things that really matter. I think, unfortunately, it's really scary. And I should have said something at the beginning. Maybe our staff will, but with the Ukraine situation reminds you that history can come back around, and if we don't let people be free and express themselves and that sort of thing. And so anyway,
I was
well, thank you.
I was watching
Yeah,
it
go ahead.
earlier. I was watching the news reports, and it made me think of when all of the Jews were killed, because they did not, and I cannot, and I love history, and right now I'm catching a blank, but it reminded me of the Jews who had to hide, and due to Hitler. And it just puts me back in that same space, watching the people talking about the wives and the children talking about leaving their husbands to fight for Ukraine. And because they love that place, and now they're having to identify, do I go to Poland? Do I go here? Do I go there? And as an American, to think, if I had to flee and to leave my husband behind for him to fight for our liberties and to protect our home, it's unfathomable to just think that I know it's far, but not that far away in 2022, we are still having such conversations. And it makes me even more thankful for having these rights, but at the same time, I for humanity, I worry about our fellow humans.
People
So-
can get a distorted view of things really quickly, and that's what's so terrifying. You think about all the Germans who went and, who may have not disagreed with their country's direction at the time somehow because of they believed a distorted view. So anyway, it is really scary. Well, thank y'all so much. Come on over to the